It is evening in Jerusalem. The city below breathes with a kind of lazy warmth, the way cities do when nothing terrible is happening yet. On the rooftop of the palace, a king is standing alone. He could not sleep. He took a walk, and then he looked down. There was a woman bathing in the courtyard below. She was beautiful. That part everyone remembers. What nobody talks about is what happened in the next 30 seconds. Because those 30 seconds were the real turning point. Not the night that followed. Not the morning after. The 30 seconds where a man who had written more honest poetry about God than almost any human being in history looked at something he had no right to look at, and instead of turning away, leaned in. He sent a servant to find out who she was. That is where the story actually begins, and if you think you already know how it ends, I promise you, you don't. Not the version we're going to tell today. Because this story is not ultimately about lust. It is not even ultimately about David or Bathsheba, or the dead man who never knew what was coming. This story is about what happens to a human soul when it is given everything. Power, glory, love, calling, and then quietly, gradually stops paying attention. It is about the architecture of a cover-up, the weight of a secret carried at the top of the world, and what it costs, what it actually costs to become whole again when you have broken something that cannot be unbroken. This is one of the darkest passages in the entire Bible. God put it there on purpose, and we need to look at it clearly. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the rooftop. Before the rooftop, in the year that the Bible calls the time when kings go out to war, David stayed home. It is a single sentence in 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 1. Easy to skip, almost impossible to overstate in its importance. Because that sentence is the real opening of this tragedy. Before there was a rooftop. Before there was a glance. Before there was a letter written in a king's own handwriting that would send an innocent man to his death. There was a spring day in Jerusalem when David looked at the calendar, saw that it was campaign season, watched his army march out under the command of Joab, and then turned around and went back to bed. Now we do not know exactly why David stayed behind. Maybe he was tired, maybe he felt he had earned the rest. He had been at war in one form or another since he was a teenager. He had fought lions and bears as a shepherd boy. He had killed Goliath with a sling and a stone. He had survived years as a fugitive, hunted by a king who wanted him dead, sleeping in caves, eating what he could find, leading a band of loyal outcasts across the desert. He had then fought his way to the throne of Israel, unified the tribes, defeated enemies on every side, and built Jerusalem into a capital worthy of a great nation. By any measure, the man had earned a break. But here is what the Bible understands about human beings that we often miss. The most spiritually dangerous moment in a person's not crisis. It is comfort. Crisis clarifies. Crisis forces prayer, forces dependence, forces awareness of how small you are and how much you need something bigger than yourself. Comfort does the opposite. Comfort lets you forget, and in forgetting it opens a door. David had a calling. He was a warrior king, not just by title but by vocation, a man shaped by God for exactly this kind of season, and when kings go out to war, he stayed home. He abandoned the post. He chose ease over purpose. And in the vacuum that created, in the long, idle afternoon with nothing demanding his attention, his eyes landed somewhere they were never supposed to land, and everything that followed became possible. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because this is the insight that changes everything about how we read this story. David's first sin was not what he did that night with Bathsheba. David's first sin far more ordinary, far more relatable, and far more dangerous. He stopped showing up for the life he was called to live. Now there he is on the rooftop, evening air, city below, and a woman named Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite, bathing in the courtyard of her home near the palace. Here is where we have to be careful, because there is a long history of this story being told in ways that subtly blame Bathsheba, as though her bathing was an act of seduction, as though she had some responsibility for what followed. The text does not support this. She was bathing in her own home, performing a ritual purification required by the law of Moses. She had no reason to imagine the king was watching. The power in this scene belongs entirely to David. He is the one on the elevated platform. He is the one with the servants who can answer questions. He is the one who makes the choice about what happens next, and he makes it. He asks. He finds out that she is married. He sends for her anyway. He sleeps with her, and then he sends her home. For a moment, it seems like it might just be a terrible thing that happens and then stops happening. A sin, yes. A violation, yes. But a contained one, perhaps. That is what David probably told himself in the morning. Then she sends him a message, 2 words in Hebrew. 2 words that collapse the carefully maintained fiction that this was manageable. She is pregnant. And that is where the second act of this story begins. The part that is, in some ways, even more disturbing than the first. There is something deeply revealing about how a person responds when they are about to be caught. Not the sin itself, but the frantic, brilliant, increasingly desperate engineering of the cover-up. Because the cover-up tells you something the sin alone cannot. It tells you how much the person cares about what others think, how creative they are under pressure, and, most importantly, how far they are willing to go to protect a version of themselves that is no longer true. David's first attempt at a solution is elegant in its simplicity. Uriah is a soldier. Uriah is currently at the front lines of the war that David himself chose not to attend. So David summons Uriah back to Jerusalem on the pretext of a military briefing, gets a report on how the battle is going, and then tells Uriah to go home and rest. Go home to his wife, have a night with her, and in a few weeks when Bathsheba begins to show, everyone will assume the child is Uriah's. Clean painless. No one gets hurt, except Uriah doesn't go home. He sleeps at the gate of the palace with the servants on the ground. And when David finds out the next morning and summons him, "Why didn't you go home?" Uriah's answer is one of the most quietly devastating moments in all of Scripture. He says, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my master Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. Let that land." Uriah the Hittite, a foreigner, a man from a people who were not born into the covenant of Israel, is living by a code of solidarity and honor that the king of Israel has just completely abandoned. David stayed home from war to sleep with someone else's wife. Uriah was called home from war and refused to sleep with his own wife out of solidarity with his fellow soldiers. In this single act of refusal, Uriah holds up a mirror to David and shows him exactly what he has become. David tries again. He invites Uriah to dinner. He gets him drunk. Surely a man with enough wine in him will go home to his wife, surely. But Uriah, even drunk, sleeps at the gate again. He will not cross his own conscience, even under the influence, even at the king's insistence. And in that moment, I believe something shifts inside David. Because now Uriah is not just an inconvenience. Uriah is a living, breathing accusation. Every time this man opens his mouth and speaks with honor, every time he refuses the comfortable escape David is trying to push him toward, he is, without knowing it, exposing the exact dimensions of David's failure. Uriah cannot be allowed to keep doing that. So David calls Joab, his general, and he writes a letter. And the letter says, "Put Uriah at the front of the heaviest fighting, and then pull everyone else back, so that he is struck down and dies." David wrote that letter in his own handwriting. I want you to hold that image. This is the man who wrote, also in his own hand, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The man who wrote, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil." The man whose poetry about God's faithfulness and love and protection has comforted grieving human beings for 3,000 years. That same hand wrote a death warrant for a loyal soldier whose only crime was loving his wife too much to betray his brothers on the battlefield. He sealed the letter and gave it to Uriah to carry to Joab. Uriah carried his own death sentence in his pocket, trusted his king enough not to open it, and delivered it faithfully to the front. There is no record in the Bible of Uriah saying anything suspicious. No record of fear. He was a soldier. He trusted the chain of command. He walked back into a war zone carrying a document that guaranteed his death, and he walked in with his head up because he was that kind of man. Joab received the letter and did what it said. He positioned Uriah in the most dangerous position in the assault on the city of Rabbah, and when the defenders counterattacked, the other soldiers pulled back and Uriah was killed. When the messenger brought the news to David, there is a moment in the text that I find almost unbearable in its coldness. David receives the report that soldiers have died, including Uriah, and his response is, "Tell Joab not to be discouraged. The sword devours one as well as another. Keep pushing. Don't let this slow you down." That is the sound of a man who has convinced himself that this was a military casualty, not a murder. That is what the human mind does when it has committed something it cannot face directly. It rewrites the story until it becomes survivable. Bathsheba mourned her husband. The text notes her mourning with a kind of spare, unflinching honesty that is characteristic of 2 Samuel. When her period of mourning was over, David sent for her, and she became his wife, and she bore him a son. And then comes the final line of chapter 11. One sentence, 11 words in English. The entire chapter has described this intricate, catastrophic sequence of events. The affair, the pregnancy, the cover-up, the murder, and the chapter closes not with condemnation, not with catastrophe, but with this. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. That's all. Just that. The most brutal understatement in the history of literature. The chapter closes. There are no alarms, no armies marching on Jerusalem, no lightning from the sky, no immediate punishment. Just 11 words like a door being quietly, firmly, permanently closed, and then nothing happens. For approximately a year, nothing happens. This is the part of the story that almost nobody talks about. The year of silence. Because the confrontation with Nathan the prophet, which we are all moving toward, happens a year later, after the child is born. Which means David spent roughly a year as the most powerful man in Israel, conducting the business of a kingdom, receiving praise from his subjects, perhaps even worshiping at the tabernacle, while living entirely inside a lie. What was that year like? David tells us himself. He doesn't tell us in Psalm 51, which he wrote after the confrontation. He tells us in Psalm 32, which is often overlooked in this story, and which may be the most honest document David ever produced. Because in Psalm 32, he describes not the aftermath of repentance, but the experience of unrepented sin. He writes it in retrospect, but the memory is visceral and clear. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long, for day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. This is a man describing a physical deterioration, his bones wasting, his strength draining, the hand of God pressing down on him like a weight he cannot escape. And he kept silent. He did not confess. He did not reach out to a priest or a prophet or God himself, and as what he had done, he carried it. And it was killing him. There is something deeply important here about how the Bible understands sin, not primarily as a legal violation requiring punishment, but as a kind of wound. A wound that, if left unaddressed, does not simply stay the same. It spreads, it infects, it changes the chemistry of a person from the inside out. David was not just morally guilty. He was, by his own description, physically unraveling. And yet he stayed silent, because confessing meant becoming that man, the man who had done this. And as long as he did not say it out loud, some part of him could maintain the fiction that he was still, somewhere underneath, the David who had been anointed as a boy, the David who had danced before the ark, the David who was a man after God's own heart. Confession would make it permanent. Silence was the only way to stay suspended between the person he had been and the person he had become. But you cannot stay suspended forever. One day, Nathan came to see the king. Nathan was a prophet, which in ancient Israel meant something very specific. He was a man who had access to the throne and the authority on God's behalf to say things that no one else was permitted to say. He was not David's enemy. He was in some ways David's closest theological advisor. He had been with David through important moments in the kingdom's history. He was trusted, and Nathan came in and told David a story. He said, "There were 2 men in a city. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man had enormous flocks, sheep and cattle beyond counting. The poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb which he had bought and raised himself. The lamb grew up with his children. It ate from his plate, drank from his cup, slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him." Then a traveler came to visit the rich man, and rather than take from his own vast flocks to feed his guest, the rich man took the poor man's lamb, killed it, and served it. It is a simple story, but it does something precise and surgical. It bypasses all of David's defenses, all the rationalizations, all the rewrites, all the carefully constructed narrative about military casualties and protocol and the complicated nature of royal responsibility. It bypasses all of that because it arrives not as an accusation but as an injustice that has nothing to do with David, or so he thinks. And David, the true David, the David who had a genuine sense of justice deep in his bones despite everything, the David who really had been shaped by God, David erupted. "The man who did this deserves to die," he declared. "He should restore fourfold to the poor man because he had no pity." He declared his own sentence, and then Nathan looked at him and said 4 of the most devastating words in the entire Bible. "You are the man." 3 words in Hebrew, 4 in English, the shortest sermon ever preached. And David, the most powerful man in his world, had no answer, because he had just heard himself, from a safe analytical distance, pronounce judgment on what he had done. He had felt the full moral weight of it clearly without the fog of self-interest for one clear moment, and the clarity was unbearable. What follows in the text is not a lengthy theological argument. It is not Nathan listing David's crimes in legal language. Nathan simply continues. God says, "I your master's house. I gave you his wives. I gave you Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes?" Do you hear what God is not saying there? God is not saying, "Why did you want more?" He is saying, "You already had everything. I was going to give you whatever you needed. You didn't have to take anything. The tragedy of David's sin is not that he was a greedy man. It is that he was a loved man who forgot, in one idle, powerful afternoon, that he was loved. And out of that forgetting came everything else. The consequences Nathan announces are specific and painful. The child born from the union with Bathsheba will not survive. The sword will not depart from David's house, meaning the violence he used against Uriah will become a recurring pattern within his own family. And this is the most brutally ironic consequence. What David did to Uriah in secret will be done to David in public before all Israel. David responds with 5 words. I have sinned against the Lord, that is all. No excuses, no explanation. No blame shifted to the circumstances, or to Bathsheba's beauty, or to the pressure of leadership, or to the fact that he had after all done many great things for Israel. Just, I have sinned against the Lord. The most naked 5 words a king had ever spoken. And Nathan says, the Lord has taken away your sin, you will not die. But the child is sick. David fasted and prayed for 7 days. He lay on the ground all night. The servants could not get him to eat. He was not performing grief. He was inside it completely without management or dignity. And on the 7th day, the child died. The servants were afraid to tell him, thinking he might do something terrible in his despair. But David noticed their whispering and understood. He got up. He washed his face. He changed his clothes. He went to the house of God and worshipped. And then he went home and ate. His servants were baffled. They asked him, while the child was alive, you fasted and wept. Now that the child is dead, you get up and eat? And David said something that has echoed across centuries of human experience with grief and God. While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. There is a theology of grief in those few sentences that no formal doctrinal statement has ever quite captured. David is not performing strength. He is not pretending the loss does not hurt. He is simply recognizing that prayer is for the living, and the dead are in God's hands, and there is a moment when you have to wash your face and keep going, not because the pain is over, but because life is still happening and you are still in it. Sometime after this, Bathsheba conceived again, and this time she had a son. They called him Solomon, and the Lord loved him and sent word through Nathan to give him another name, Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. From the ruins of the worst thing David ever did, out of the relationship that began in betrayal and ended in grief, came a child who would be loved by God, who would build the temple, who would be remembered as the wisest man who ever lived. Grace does not erase the past, but it is apparently capable of growing something extraordinary inside the wreckage of it. Now, I want to step back from the narrative for a moment and ask the question that I think this entire story is really driving toward. Because it is the question that makes people uncomfortable. It is the question that, if you are honest, you have probably already been asking somewhere in the back of your mind. Why did God keep David on the throne? Not just keep him alive, though that itself is remarkable, given that the law of Moses prescribed death for both adultery and murder, but keep him as king. Keep him in a position of leadership over the people of God. Keep him as the man whose name would define the royal line through which, centuries later, the Messiah would come. Why? This is not a trivial question, and it is not one the Bible tries to hide from. In fact, there is a single verse in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 5, that addresses it with a kind of blunt, startling honesty. It says that David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord and had not failed to keep any of the Lord's commands all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. Except. That word is doing enormous work in that sentence. Except for the adultery, the manipulation, the conspiracy, the murder, the year of silence and pretense. Except for all of that, David was faithful. And somehow the Bible presents that as a meaningful statement rather than an absurd one. I think the answer lies in something that we in the modern world have enormous difficulty understanding, because we have reduced faithfulness to a performance scorecard. We think that being right with God means having a clean record, that the measure of a person's spiritual life is the absence of catastrophic failure. And if that is the standard, then David's story is simply a story about a man who failed the standard and was inexplicably, unfairly, perhaps immorally let off the hook. But that is not what the Bible presents as the measure of a life lived before God. The Bible's measure, as expressed through story after story in both the Old and New Testaments, is something different. It is about the direction of the heart. Not the perfection of the record, but the orientation of the life. Not whether you have fallen, but whether when you fall and are found out, you own it completely and turn back. David, when Nathan said, "You are the man," did not call his lawyers. He did not accuse Nathan of political motivation. He did not point to his long record of service to Israel, or to the fact that he had spared Saul's life twice when he had the chance to kill him, or to the wars he had won and the enemies he had defeated. He did not negotiate. He did not minimize. He said 5 words and meant all of them. That response is not automatic. It is not easy. It is, in fact, extraordinarily rare among human beings who hold power. The natural human response to being caught is self-protection, rationalization, blame-shifting, the minimizing of harm, the highlighting of extenuating circumstances. David did none of this. And whatever that capacity for honest self-confrontation cost him, and it cost him enormously, as the rest of his life would demonstrate, it was the thing that God apparently could not overlook. This is not a comfortable theology. It does not let David off the hook, because the consequences were real and lasting and devastating. But it also does not reduce faithfulness to a performance metric. It locates the essence of spiritual life somewhere deeper than behavior, in the honesty and openness of a person's relationship with the truth about themselves. That is a much more demanding standard than rule following. It is also a much more hopeful one. Now I want to tell you one more thing about this story. One thing that I think is the most quietly devastating detail of all, and that most people never notice because it is buried in the New Testament, in a genealogy that most readers skip over entirely. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, the author traces the lineage of Jesus Christ, beginning with Abraham and working forward through the generations. When he arrives at David, he writes this: David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Matthew does not call her Bathsheba. He calls her Uriah's wife. In the genealogy of Jesus Christ, in the list of ancestors that the Gospel of Matthew uses to anchor the Messiah in the history of God's people, Uriah the Hittite is named. A foreigner, a soldier, a man who was killed by the king he served, a man who never knew the full extent of what was done to him. His name is in the lineage of Jesus. God did not erase Uriah from the story. God did not let David's cover-up stand as the permanent record. In the most important document in human history, in the genealogy that traces the arrival of salvation into the world, the name of the man David tried to disappear is written down, permanently, where it will be read as long as the Gospel of Matthew is read. I do not know what to do with that except sit quietly with it for a moment. Because it means something about how God keeps accounts that goes far beyond anything our usual categories of justice and mercy can contain. It means the victims are not forgotten. It means the powerful do not get the final edit. It means that grace does not require the erasure of the wronged in order to redeem the wrongdoer. Both things, the redemption of David and the memorialization of Uriah, can exist simultaneously in God's story. That is not just a theological claim. It is a deeply human comfort, because all of us have at some point been on the wrong side of someone else's choice. All of us have carried wounds that were not our fault, that were inflicted by people who were supposed to protect us and did not. And the question that haunts those experiences is whether it matters. Whether the wound registered anywhere permanent. Whether the person who caused it got to simply walk away and write their own version. The Gospel of Matthew says, "No, record is complete, the witness is kept. Uriah is in the book." And I think that brings us finally to the question that this video has really been about from the beginning. Not David's question, yours. Because you are watching this for a reason. Maybe it is simply curiosity about a famous biblical story. But maybe it is something else. Maybe you are somewhere in this story yourself. Not necessarily in David's position, though some of you are, and you know it. Maybe you are in Uriah's position, carrying something that was done to you by someone who had more power than you, and wondering whether it matters. Maybe you are in Bathsheba's position, swept up in a situation not of your choosing and trying to survive it. Maybe you are in Joab's position, complicit in something you did not initiate but did not stop, and living with that knowledge. Maybe you are in Nathan's position, knowing the truth about someone you care about and not knowing whether to say it. Wherever you are in this story, here is what I want you to take with you. Grace is not the cancellation of consequences. The child still died. The sword did not depart from David's house. The grief was real and lasting. Grace did not erase any of that. What grace did was refuse to let the worst thing you ever did become the only thing you ever were. What grace did was keep building, keep working, keep weaving, keep placing names in genealogies and raising up wise sons from complicated unions, even when the material it had to work with was broken. David's greatness was not that he never fell. His greatness was that he had a relationship with God that was honest enough to survive the fall. Not comfortable, not painless, not clean, but honest. And honest turned out to be enough. The most dangerous thing in this story is not the rooftop, and it is not the letter, and it is not even the year of silence. The most dangerous thing in this story is the moment David stood on the roof in the evening air and stopped paying attention to who he was and what he had been called to do. That is where every catastrophe like this one begins. Not with a dramatic evil choice, but with a quiet drift away from the life you were made for. An afternoon with nothing particular to do. A comfortable distance from the fight. A small, private decision not to show up. Pay attention to those moments. They are the ones that matter. And if you have already had yours, if you are already standing somewhere in the wreckage of a choice you cannot take back, wondering whether the distance between you and God is now permanent, then hear this. The Bible did not have to include this story. God did not have to preserve it. The scribes who copied these texts across centuries could have softened it, could have given David a better excuse, could have made the sin more understandable and the consequences more comfortable. They did not, because the story, exactly as it is, with all its ugliness and all its grace, is the point. The God of this story is not interested in a cleaned-up version of you. He is interested in the actual you. The one who makes terrible choices and lives in silence and feels the weight of things not confessed and sometimes does not know how to find the way back. He found David on a rooftop. He will find you where you are. The only question is whether when he does you will say the 5 words that cost David everything and gave him back his life. I have sinned against the Lord. 5 words. And then the silence breaks. And then something new and painful and real, and ultimately more beautiful than anything the cover-up could have produced, begins.